Global royalty and world leaders will be on the guest list at the funeral for Pope Francis, which is scheduled to take place this coming Saturday. Catholic cardinals have been meeting at the Vatican to discuss the final details of the service, which will be held at the heart.
At St. Peter's Square, there were tens of thousands of people packing in. The Argentine flag was folded with great care and placed next to a portrait that was already well known. Within the confines of the chapel, Maria Elena Bergoglio clenched her will tightly, her voice shaking as she read the final lines, which read, "I leave no material wealth, but I leave you an immeasurable treasure." Despite the fact that no one knew what was written in the will, the reaction of the family captured the attention of the entire world. In spite of the fact that they were crying, they were not dissatisfied with the loss of money. Rather, they were crying because of what they had just realized. At the funeral of one of the most powerful people in the world, what was it that Pope Francis left behind that caused his own relatives to shed tears? In Buenos Aires, Argentina, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born in a neighborhood known as Flores, which is considered to be a working-class neighborhood. Despite the fact that his family, who were of Italian immigrant descent, did not live in a wealthy or impoverished state, it was necessary to save everything in the house. His father worked as an accountant for a railway company, and his mother was a reserved but well-behaved housewife. Due to the fact that Jorge was the oldest of 5 children, he was accustomed to taking responsibility at an early age. His upbringing was completely different from that of the millions of other children who grew up in Buenos Aires. With the exception of one thing, he never failed to pay close attention to who was crying, even if it was a complete stranger. Jorge was a young man who was passionate about music and football. In addition to being a devoted fan of San Lorenzo, he was also known to play football with his friends on the neighborhood streets. Despite the fact that he put in a lot of effort in his studies, he did not believe that he would end up becoming a priest. Subsequent to his graduation from high school, he pursued a degree in chemical engineering and subsequently found employment in a laboratory. There are not many people who are aware of the fact that he earned additional income by working as a housekeeper for a family and as a bouncer at a local nightclub. When Jorge was a young man, his life was not about the church. Rather, it was about independence, experimentation, and making a living just like any other young man. The defining moment occurred in 1958, when Jorge was 21 years old. When he made a confession that would change his life in a small church, he stated that he felt moved to his very core. He was not coerced into a life of religious devotion. On the contrary, his mother was adamantly opposed to taking that step. On the other hand, Jorge made the decision to become a Jesuit, which resulted in the termination of all other secular avenues. It was in 1969 when he was ordained as a priest. In 1973, when Argentina was in the midst of a period of political unrest, he was promoted to the position of provincial Jesuit. Priests, intellectuals, and dissidents were among those who were kidnapped and tortured during this inhumane period of time when the military regime was in power. Jorge was suspected and criticized during this time period. However, it was also during this time that he learned a valuable lesson about the importance of remaining silent, having patience, and the cost of remaining steadfast. He was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires in the year 1998. Particularly noteworthy is the fact that he declined to relocate to the Episcopal Palace, opting instead to reside in a modest flat located in a residential neighborhood. He did his own laundry, cooked his own meals, and traveled by bus. He was self-sufficient. The authorities in the area referred to him as the bishop that everyone has seen on the tube. Jorge did not alter his way of life after he was elevated to the rank of cardinal in the year 2001. He entered the Vatican with nothing more than a small suitcase in his possession. He was a candidate for the position of pope during the conclave that took place in 2005, but he withdrew from the race in the final round. Jorge Mario Bergoglio became the pontiff in 2013, following the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI. He assumed the name Francis I Pope, making him the first person in the history of the Catholic Church to originate from the Southern Hemisphere, Latin America, and the Society of Jesus. One of the first statements that was so obvious that it did not require any explanation was the selection of the name Francis, which was a reference to Saint Francis of Assisi, who sacrificed his wealth in order to help the less fortunate. Beginning on that day, people all over the world started to notice a different pope. There will be no glittering robes, no fancy red leather shoes, and no penthouse with a view of the Vatican. He was a driver of a Fiat 500 and lived in the more straightforward Casa Santa Marta. There were a lot of people who thought that this simplicity was a staged image and did not believe that it was real. On the other hand, those who lived next to him in Buenos Aires stated that he maintained the same way of life for many years. For the purpose of impressing, Francis did not choose simplicity. It was the way he carried himself. From Flores to the Vatican, the journey was not a triumphant one. Rather, it was a series of decisions that defied the expectations of society while traveling. He gave up money, status, comfort, applause, and even insignificant things like the right to silence one by one. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was one of the people who did this. There was a cost associated with each step, and out of everything he had to leave behind, the only thing he retained was the reason he had entered the chapel when he was 21 years old. In the first place, a straightforward conviction that the only thing that truly mattered was to live for the sake of other people. He was outspoken in his criticism of clerics who lived lavishly, calling them lost in their spirituality. This criticism was made during his first year of his ministry. It was not in Francis's best interest to travel in a luxury vehicle in a city where the less fortunate were begging on the streets. He was looking for comfort. The assertion was not rhetorical in nature. Action was taken in support of it. In order to ensure the integrity of Vatican financial institutions, he ordered a thorough audit. At the same time that he demanded unprecedented levels of public financial reporting, he also introduced regulations to combat money laundering. Nevertheless, the manner in which Francis approaches global issues from a moral standpoint is of greater significance. In his role as Pope, he does not differentiate between his responsibility to the world and his role as Pope. Laudato Si, a document that advocated for humanity to reevaluate its relationship with the natural world, was published by him in the year 2015. Not only was the document directed towards Catholics, but it made reference to all of humanity. Francis warned that the destruction of the environment was not a scientific issue, but rather a moral one, and he referred to the earth as our shared home. The poorest people are the ones who are the first to suffer when people prioritize profit over responsibility. After that, he went on to produce Fratelli Tutti, a document that advocated for brotherhood across all demographics, including religious, ethnic, and ideological differences. His argument was that disagreements are not the source of conflict. Rather, it is the lack of trust and dialogue that leads to conflict. Leaders of both the Muslim and Orthodox communities expressed their approval of the document, which was a significant step towards mending centuries-old rifts. Through the publication of Dilexit Nos in 2024, he made history by being the first pope to seriously question the use of technology and artificial intelligence. Francis was not only concerned about the possibility of machines taking over from humans, but he also expressed concern about the loss of moral identity in a world that was governed by algorithms. A crisis of moral silence was what he referred to it as. It is possible that a future pope would, upon reading these documents, come to the conclusion that they represent Francis's true will. Not some legal documents that are kept secret in a safe at the Vatican, but rather a set of values that have been constructed in public, step by step, over the course of more than a decade of running the Church. I do not have a bank account of my own. In the past, Francis has stated, "I don't own a house, but I know what I'm leaving behind." This statement was made during a private meeting with journalists, and he did not say it with a sense of pride, but rather with the tone of a man who is aware of the repercussions that every choice will have. When a pope refuses to own property, refuses to give property to his relatives, and refuses to allow the Church to become a cesspool of unlawfully obtained wealth, the legacy that he leaves behind is a moral test for the generations that will come after him. In his own words, Francis did not refer to them as treasures. On the other hand, Maria Elena and her relatives were able to comprehend the documents after reading them. They were aware of it. It was the only part of his legacy that he had left for them. They were moved to tears at his funeral by something that was intangible and unmeasurable, but it was enough, in light of the fact that this man, this brother, had lived up to his words. In addition, he passed away without anyone being able to accuse him of betraying the beliefs that he held dear. What is left of the family, Pope Francis had 4 siblings, but by the time he passed away, the only relative he maintained regular contact with was his younger sister, Maria Elena Bergoglio, who resided in Argentina with their 2 children. This was the relationship that he maintained with his family. The Pope's small family managed to maintain a low profile in the media throughout his more than a decade in office. There was not a single shred of evidence to suggest that they used their power for their own benefit. To our knowledge, there was no evidence to suggest that they had received financial assistance from the Vatican. Keeping that in mind was something that Francis made a conscious effort to do. On a bi-monthly basis, he called his sister for a number of years. All of the calls had nothing to do with religion or the politics of the Vatican, food, the weather, or even just a simple question like, "Are you still able to go for a walk?" were the typical topics of conversation. During one of his calls home, Francis instructed his bodyguards not to record or keep a diary of his conversations. It was his belief that if every conversation I had with my family was recorded in a historical record, then I would no longer be considered a member of my family. Maria Elena had never been a practitioner of any particular religion. She led a typical life in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. Despite the fact that she was employed as an administrator at a school, she was the only member of the family who had the courage to ask Jorge a direct question after he was elevated to the position of Pope. "If I am now a member of the Vatican, do you still consider me to be your brother?" His response was that I will continue to be Jorge so long as you keep my phone number. In the year 2025, he included a brief passage about Maria Elena in his memoirs, which were submitted to Francis for publication under the name Hope. "It was not to find out more about me that my sister asked me, but rather to make sure that I had not forgotten who I was." Due to the fact that the majority of Pope Francis's life is a story that does not have a family background, this was a rare passage in which he mentioned his relatives in an official book. Maria Elena did not make an appearance on camera during the funeral. With her back to the family pews, she stood back. The will that she read that day was not a declaration of assets, but rather a handwritten document that contained 3 things that Francis requested his family to uphold. First, he was instructed to refuse any donations, gifts, or work of a nominal nature from any organization that worked under his name. As a second piece of advice, if the goal was to make a profit, you should avoid publishing personal memoirs, letters, or photographs. Third, to continue living in the same manner as the family had lived until now, without relying on their reputation to receive special privileges. For many people, those are 3 harsh lines. However, for Maria Elena, they were Francis's way of staying true to the last value he believed in, which was not to turn respect into a tool. In a brief statement to the press after the funeral, she stated that he had left us with nothing to divide, but he had also left us with something to keep with honor. Additionally, neither of Francis's 2 nephews, who are Maria Elena's sons, have ever made a public appearance at any Vatican event. They refuse to participate in interviews. They do not make appearances in the media, and they do not solicit opportunities using the name Bergoglio. Friends claim that they were taught from a young age that Uncle Jorge is not a famous person. Rather, he is someone who performs special work in a special environment. This attitude is not the result of vanity. Rather, it is the result of a principle that has been agreed upon by the members of the family who have survived, which is to allow Francis to live out his papacy without being constrained by the expectations of his family. The image of powerful families, which is frequently seen in politics or religion, in which relatives can become a kind of satellite of the central power, is very different from this. In the case of Francis, his relatives serve as bulwarks rather than extensions. Principles were the one thing he left behind for them. It was a method of refusing to take advantage of the situation. Keeping a healthy distance from the halo was the mentality that was responsible for this. On top of that, they shed tears because he left behind nothing but those principles. It was not because of the loss of material possessions or the disappointment they experienced. Rather, it was because they realized that the role of family did not grant them any privileges, but rather it gave them a more difficult task of preserving the memory of a man who lived his life in accordance with his words. Because of the cost of integrity, the manner in which he handled the scandal involving sexual abuse in Chile constitutes one of the first major blows to his reputation. Francis initially defended a bishop who was accused of covering up abuse in 2018, stating that he had not seen any clear evidence to support the allegations. The statement was met with immediate outrage from the audience. There were a large number of victims who came forward, and Catholic organizations demanded transparency. After further reflection, Francis acknowledged that he had made a mistake. He dispatched an independent investigation, and he accepted the resignation of all of the Chilean bishops. The injury to his faith, on the other hand, was not easily made better. It was the moment that many people considered to be the moment when he lost his integrity. Despite the fact that Francis's decisions have also been controversial on a social level, he had fought so hard to maintain them. After he made the decision in 2023 to permit same-sex couples to be blessed, he was met with criticism from both sides. Conservatives accused him of acting in a manner that was contrary to the teachings of the Church. According to progressives, he did not go far enough because he continued to reject marriages between people of the same gender. The text was not revised, and Francis did not hold a press conference to provide an explanation. Simply put, he stated that love should not be denied to anyone. His reforms were implemented within the Vatican, and they touched on the most delicate areas, the finances. His actions included putting an end to questionable investments, dissolving a number of foundations that were suspected of having connections to oligarchs, and, most importantly, removing the financial immunity of a number of senior cardinals. Due to these actions, he became isolated on the inside. It was reported by Il Messaggero that at one point, a group of cardinals attempted to covertly exert pressure on him to resign, citing his deteriorating health as the reason. Despite the fact that Francis continued to work, many of his closest associates resigned or were replaced. On social media, particularly on extremist channels, conspiracy theories have emerged suggesting that Francis is concealing assets and that he is a two-faced figure who lives in poverty in order to conceal his inner power. In fact, he was referred to as a snake in a white hat by one unconventional news website. In spite of the fact that these allegations are not supported by evidence, they have gained widespread acceptance, particularly in conservative communities that are opposed to his approach to society. International politics are another source of tension in the world. In 2016, Francis boldly condemned the construction of a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico, claiming that it was unchristian. This brought him into direct conflict with the United States government at the time. This is President Donald Trump. His statement has not been retracted, despite the fact that he has been the target of attacks from media outlets that are associated with the right wing. Rather, he has insisted that faith is not utilized in the construction of walls. The cost was not merely an unfavorable factor. It was the feeling of isolation, as he was questioned by the very system that he was in charge of. A trusted priest was once told by Francis that no one is more opposed to something than the person who is trying to keep things in order. The remark was never confirmed to the general public, but it was later confirmed in the private diary of the priest. When viewed from the outside, Francis appears to be a leader who is admired all over the world. On the other hand, his reformist decisions have caused a great deal of dissatisfaction within the Vatican. This is something that Francis is aware of, and he is willing to accept, because he is aware that if he chooses to avoid conflict and play it safe, the only legacy he will leave behind is one of compromise. What light has left behind? The square in St. Peter's was completely devoid of any people that evening. Despite the absence of any program, organizers, or guides, people stood in silence for several hours. There was only the candlelight that reflected off of the ancient stone walls, which were adorned with tens of thousands of raised hands. These individuals carried photographs of Pope Francis. Only pieces of paper printed with lines that he had written were held by others. That night, the phrase, "You live as you believe," was the one that was repeated the most. In Asia, parishes all over the world are holding memorial masses. These masses are being held in places ranging from Europe to South America, from Africa to small Catholic communities. However, what is truly remarkable is that the majority of the celebrations are not coming from places of worship, but rather from individuals. In Rio de Janeiro, a group of janitors created a small altar on the sidewalk, lit candles, and recited passages from Laudato Si with the intention of honoring the Catholic Church. There was a group of students in Nairobi who were reading an English translation of Fratelli Tutti while they were camped out on campus. The church is not required to provide these images with any guidance. When they do occur, they do so in a quiet and genuine manner. While not everyone agreed with every choice that Francis made, many people believed in the fundamental legacy that he left behind. Kindness without declaration and compassion without justification are two examples of this. In a world that is becoming more and more divided by ideology, politics, and technology, Francis's legacy is not in any rules. The choice lies in living slowly, living clearly, and living for the sake of other people. He stated that he does not have any aspirations to leave behind anything of great significance. It is only through being heard that I hope to be remembered. These particular words were published on the final page of the text that Maria Elena read during the funeral service. A gentle conclusion was delivered by a man who never put himself at the center of the discussion. There was no manifesto, and there was no preaching. A number of years after Francis's passing, academics will undoubtedly compile a numerical summary of his reign. A number of documents were distributed, a number of financial reforms were implemented, and a number of internal affairs were managed. On the other hand, the policies are not what the majority of people who have even had a single encounter with him remember most about him. It is the manner in which he bowed, the manner in which he shook hands, and the manner in which he did not allow formal distance to obscure the person. There was a member of the staff at the Santa Marta guest house who recalled that on the very first day he arrived, I was about to bow down to him. I should just be called Jorge, he said. We are both employed here. These particulars are not documented in the books, but it is precisely these particulars that ensure Francis's legacy endures for a longer period of time than any sermon. This legacy that he left behind cannot be divided, cannot be measured, and cannot be transferred to another person. This is not a bank account. There is no mention of it in a will. The way in which people change after meeting him, the way in which his relatives uphold the principles he lived by, and the way in which the poor feel valued when he shows up without ceremony, are all indicators of its existence, despite the fact that it does not have any market value. Following the funeral, Maria Elena did not make any further statements. She resumed her normal routine in Buenos Aires after her return. She only responded with the phrase, "We are not mourning a pope," when she was approached by a journalist from another country for an interview. One of our brothers has passed away. In a world that is undergoing such rapid transformation, the most challenging aspect is not to come to terms with his passing, but rather to maintain the values that he held dear. At the very end of the service, there was no music playing in the background. There are no well-known hymns. The only thing that played was a recording. Francis spoke in a clear and gentle voice. The conviction that goodness has a place in this world, whether it be in the Vatican or on the streets, is the one thing I will leave you with, if I leave you with anything at all. The things that people remember most about Pope Francis are probably not the things that he clung to while he was alive, but rather the things that he was willing to give up in order to maintain his integrity. It is not about money that the story of the treasure that caused his family to cry is about. Rather, it is about how a person lives their life in such a way that, in the end, his loved ones do not feel as though they have lost, but rather feel as though they need to continue. I would appreciate it if you could leave a comment if you also discovered something from his life that is worth considering. We would be very interested in hearing your thoughts. In addition, if you found this video to be helpful, please remember to share it with others who may also find it interesting, and subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss out on the next great stories. I am grateful that you remained until the very end.